Tonight, let's embark on a journey through the seas of history to uncover the mysteries of the East India Companies. These weren't just trading ventures. They were true empires that commanded armies, fleets, and even minted their own money. How did they achieve this? And why is their influence still felt in the modern world? Get comfortable, because a story full of adventure and unexpected twists awaits you. And for even deeper historical dives and stories that will lull you to sleep, be sure to subscribe to our channel. How Spices Ruled the World: The Rise and Fall of the Dutch East India Company. Chapter 1. What are East India Companies? Perhaps you are lying with your eyes closed right now, slowly drifting off to sleep. Maybe your breathing has become a little deeper, and your body a little heavier. And somewhere on the border between sleep and wakefulness, strange words begin to surface: East India Company. What exactly is that? Why are people talking about it, and what do spices have to do with it? Today, we will embark on a long journey across seas and continents, deep into the centuries, to a place where pepper was more expensive than gold, and a modest trading office could rule half the planet. But before we dive into the essence, let's understand how it all began. The name East India Company was actually born by many. In the Age of Discovery, European powers began to create special trading corporations, private companies that received exclusive rights from the state to conduct business with overseas countries. East India was a term used at that time to designate the vast expanse from the coast of India to Japan, including Indonesia, China, Thailand, Vietnam, islands, and peninsulas that seemed almost mythical to the Western world. Every great maritime power wanted a piece of this eastern pie. Thus, the East India Companies emerged. The English established theirs in 1600, the Dutch 2 years later, in 1602. Then more, the Danish Company, 1616, the Portuguese, 1628, the French, 1664, the Austrian, 1717, the Swedish, 1731. They all strove for one goal: to control the richest overseas markets and the supply of the most valuable goods: spices, tea, porcelain, silk, and precious stones. But among all these companies, two particularly stood out, true titans, two colossi: the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. Each of them possessed not just merchant ships and warehouses, but their own armies, flotillas, fortified cities, and even the right to wage wars on behalf of their state. The greatness of these companies was measured not in the quantity of goods, but in the scale of their influence. These were giants whose power extended far beyond the borders of Europe. Our story today will be dedicated to the Dutch East India Company, also known by the acronym VOC, from its Dutch name Verenigde Oost-Indische Company. We will tell how a small Protestant republic, breaking free from Spanish rule, built the largest transnational empire in the world in a matter of decades. How it established its forts, recruited samurai, fought with the Portuguese and English, monopolized cinnamon and pepper, exported tea and porcelain, traded stocks, and created financial instruments that we still use today. And in one of the following lectures, to maintain balance, we will also tell the story of the British East India Company, which was even more enduring and no less ambitious. Now, relax even more, and allow yourself to drift with the current of history. Imagine the warm wind, the sea breeze, the aroma of dried nutmeg and cinnamon, lingering in the holds of merchant ships. The story is just beginning. Imagine Amsterdam in the 17th century, a city where you could buy shares in a company sending ships to lands no one had yet written books about, where spices turned into gold and ships into naval fleets, where an ordinary merchant could get so rich from one successful shipment that his name would forever enter the annals. It was there that the story of the VOC was born, a corporation that became a state. And very soon, We will journey with it across the oceans, through storms, to islands where cloves grow, and to bays where samurai stand. Let's delve into the past, to where the scent of nutmeg fills the air. Chapter 2. Why was everyone hunting for spices? By the way, my dears, have you ever wondered why every kitchen, even the simplest, has black pepper? Why are cinnamon, vanilla, ginger, cardamom, and nutmeg available to us in the supermarket for literally a couple of coins? It seems so mundane, so simple: a pinch of cinnamon in your morning porridge, a drop of vanilla in your baked goods, pepper in every other dish. And only history remembers what this luxury cost centuries ago. In the Middle Ages, spices were a luxury item on par with diamonds. For a pound of nutmeg, you could buy 3 sheep. For a small bag of pepper, you could exchange a sizable piece of land, and a gram of saffron could cost almost as much as a gram of gold. They were valued not only for their taste and aroma but also for their almost mystical properties. Spices were considered medicines, aphrodisiacs, charms, sacred substances bringing health and good luck. They were like gold, but with a scent. At a time when food was poorly preserved, spices could mask the taste of spoiled meat, and in hospitals and monasteries, spices were used as remedies for mental and physical ailments. But where did they grow? Spices were obtained far in the east, on islands that Europeans called the Spice Islands. These are the modern Moluccas, Java, Sumatra, Banda, Ceylon. All of this is Southeast Asia, the very East Indies, where the ships of trading companies aspired to go. Obtaining spices was a long, complex, and literally deadly business. One expedition could last a year and end in death from a storm, disease, or pirate attack. Only 1 out of 3 ships would return, and even then, it was so profitable that people would mortgage their homes and pool family capital to finance a voyage to the East Indies. Because if a ship returned, it would return with gold, only packed in bags of pepper. Imagine distant islands, hot sun, humid jungles, and in the forest, cinnamon grows, with nutmeg trees nearby. Everything smells so bright and sweet that your head spins. This was a land where every tree was a treasure chest. And Europeans wanted all of it at any cost. But spices were just the beginning. The Dutch East India Company, like its English sister, was not limited to just the spice trade. Gradually, it began to explore everything that could be sold, from silk and tea to porcelain and opium. Yes, opium. That word still has a special connotation. Originally a medicine, later a means of control. The British made it the main export to China, but the Dutch also played a role. Opium, like spices, became a political, commercial, and strategic tool. Later, it would lead to the Opium Wars, the fall of the Qing dynasty, and tragic pages in Asian history. But that's a completely different story. Today we will talk about a time when the whole world seemed vast and full of mysteries, and spices were so valuable that cities were burned, marriages were concluded, people were killed, and entire empires were created for their sake. And against this background emerged the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, the world's first truly transnational corporation. A company with an army, a fleet, its own currency, flag, and diplomats. So powerful that it could declare war or sign a peace treaty on behalf of the state. So rich that, by some estimates, at the peak of its influence, it would be worth over $7 trillion today. Even the largest modern corporations, such as Apple or Amazon, pale in comparison. But more on all that later. For now, just close your eyes and imagine a merchant ship. It's sailing on a warm sea, with bags of pepper and cloves in its holds, sailors full of hope in their cabins, and on the horizon, the East Indies, a land of wealth and death, of gold and spices. The story is just beginning. Chapter 3: The Portuguese, Malacca, and the start of the race. In every great story, there is a gateway, a place where roots begin, winds converge, and interests collide. For the history of spices, that gateway was Malacca, a small city on the coast of the Strait of Malacca, located in modern-day Malaysia. Modest by European standards, but absolutely key to the fate of all Asian trade. To understand why it was so, imagine a map. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow sea passage between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. All trading ships sailing between India and China passed through it. This meant that anyone who wanted to control the spice route had to control Malacca. This city essentially became a cork in a bottle, both commercially and geopolitically. But let's start a little earlier. The spices we talked about grew far from here, on the so-called Spice Islands: Banda, Ternate, Tidore, Java, Ceylon. There, nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves were harvested. Then the spices were brought to Malacca, the main port of the region. There, Arab and Indian merchants bought them, loaded them onto caravans, and transported them through a chain of trading posts deep into Asia and then to Europe. This was a long chain, and everyone who held at least one link in it earned untold riches. Just think, according to chroniclers' estimates, spices changed hands 12 times on their way from Southeast Asia to the European table, and each subsequent seller sold for more. Therefore, even a gram of merchandise, especially valuable ones like saffron and nutmeg, became a true treasure. The city of Malacca became the natural center of attraction for all who wanted to participate in this business, and thus an arena of endless struggle. On the shore, ships of Arabs, Chinese, Javanese, and Indians constantly stood, all waiting for a favorable wind, because maritime trade of those times depended not on engines, but on monsoons, seasonal winds that blew with astonishing regularity. While the monsoon blew in one direction, merchants set off. When the wind changed, they returned. Malacca became the place where traders waited out the season, replenished supplies, repaired ships, and negotiated, quarreled, and intrigued. And at the beginning of the 16th century, new players entered this boiling trading point, the Portuguese. In 1511, a fleet equipped in Lisbon approached Malacca. They realized that capturing the source of spices itself was too dangerous and distant, but controlling their circulation was well within their power. Malacca was a logical choice. The Portuguese attacked and captured the city, establishing a fortress on the site of the old trading post. Thus began European control over the spice trade. This was a turning point. Previously, spices were traded by Muslims and Indians, and only crumbs from their table remained for Europeans. Now Europe directly entered Asian trade and quickly realized, this is gold in packets. The Portuguese began to build factories along the entire coast, in India, Sri Lanka, Africa, and the Moluccas. They gained control over the route, and it was they who began to dictate terms. For almost 84 years, Portugal maintained a monopoly on spice supplies to Europe. It was during this time that it transformed into a maritime empire. Lisbon became rich, the elite prospered, cinnamon in ampoules was sold in the streets, and nutmeg became a symbol of wealth. But, as often happens, growth was followed by stagnation. The Portuguese jealously guarded their maps, hired only their own people, and kept the entire market secret. They refused to share navigation technologies and trained their navigators in secret. This became their weak point, because at the very same time, the Dutch, left without access to ports due to the Spanish blockade, began to search for their own way to the spices. And at the center of their attraction was still Malacca. The Dutch understood, whoever owns this city owns everything. And to get there, they first had to understand the routes, get maps, assemble a fleet, and most importantly, learn to survive in this ocean of opportunities and deadly storms. It is from here, from Malacca, that the history of the VOC begins, because one day a ship with a Dutch flag will enter it. Not just for spices, but for domination. Because, unlike all previous traders, the VOC would become not an intermediary, but a new master. But until that moment, a little more time would pass. And now, imagine the morning in the port, the humid air, the aromas of pepper, curry, sweat, smoke, cinnamon, the hum of hundreds in dozens of languages, ships at anchor, and in those holds, the fate of future empires is already hiding. Chapter 4: Holland in Search of the Path to Spices. The history of spices is a story not only of trade but also of power. To understand how and why the Dutch East India Company emerged, one must look at what was happening in Europe at the end of the 16th century. Because without the Spanish lion, there would have been no Dutch dragon. At that time, Spain was the most powerful nation in Europe. Its fleet plied the Atlantic, its galleons carried gold and silver from the New World, and the royal treasury jingled with coins. After the unification with Portugal in 1580, one monarch controlled everything one could wish for. Spanish colonies in America, Portuguese trading posts in Asia, control over Africa, trade with China and India, a monopoly on spices, sugar, gold, and slaves. It seemed as if the empire would last forever. But in its shadow, a rebellion was already brewing. The Netherlands, which were part of the Spanish crown, grew increasingly weary of this situation. The Spanish crown interfered in their internal affairs, imposed Catholicism in Protestant cities, levied taxes, and prohibited free trade. All this, against the background of the cultural and religious independence of the Dutch, gradually began to escalate into alienation. The alliance of Spain with Portugal hit the Netherlands particularly hard. From that moment on, the Portuguese colonies, the main source of spices, fell under Spanish control. This meant that all the ports where the Dutch could previously go for goods were closed. Moreover, the Spanish fleet began to sink Dutch ships, arrest captains, and block sea routes. The Dutch were literally squeezed out of the spice market. This was not just an economic crisis, it was a war for survival. Dutch merchants found themselves cut off from the main source of wealth, the East Indies. And without the spice trade, the Dutch economy could not exist. In response, the 80 Years' War for Independence began, the struggle of the Netherlands against Spanish rule. The Dutch did not give up. They not only revolted but also began to seek alternative routes. If they couldn't buy spices from the Portuguese, they had to reach them directly. If old maps were secret, they had to steal them. If they couldn't hire a navigator, they had to train their own. This was the beginning of an era when a small but persistent country decided to stand against a giant empire. And it was at this very moment that a special type of Dutch merchant was born. Not just a trader, but a scout, a navigator, an entrepreneur, and a pirate all rolled into one. The first expeditions to the East Indies were desperate. People sailed into the unknown with stolen or forged maps across stormy seas, without the certainty of returning. Many of them were killed, drowned, betrayed. But those who returned brought with them ships filled with spices, and with them, hope. The Dutch began to act. They equipped ships, bought information, bribed. And in 1596, the first expedition reached the island of Java. There, amidst the greenery and humid air, they saw paradise. Cinnamon and cloves grew everywhere. All that for which wars were fought, here it was simply plucked from the trees. They founded a factory, the first Dutch trading post in the East Indies. This was an event. Only one of 3 ships returned, but it recouped the entire voyage. The profit was astronomical. This sent a signal: we can trade directly, without the Spanish, without the Portuguese, without intermediaries. But there was another signal as well. Those who brought profit gained unlimited respect and with it, power. Dutch merchants became national heroes. Ballads were written in their honor. Their portraits hung in the halls of town halls. They were not just making money, they were building an empire. At the same time, Holland, previously divided, officially declared its independence. The northern provinces united into the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands, and the south remained under Spanish control. In the new republic, the most important force was not the army, not the royal court, but business. It was under these conditions, against the backdrop of a rapidly growing economy, the desire for independence, and the will to control trade, that the idea emerged that would change everything. Instead of many small companies competing for cargo, ships, and maps, create one great one that would unite everyone and become a new form of power. Thus, literally a couple of years later, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, would appear. But its official birth was still 2 years away. And now, imagine an evening in Amsterdam, the canals, the lanterns, the windows of shops, behind which merchants in hats calculate profits, discussing how much a pound of cloves costs. And somewhere far away, on Java, at that very minute, the monsoon is approaching, ships are preparing to depart, on board is gold, only not in ingots, but in bags of spices. Chapter 5. The first VOC factories on Java. The spice trade wasn't just profitable, it was a secret business. Every new sea chart, every freshwater point, every bay where cinnamon and clove trees grew was kept secret, as if it were a state military secret. And indeed, in the 17th century, it was a military secret, because spices equaled gold, and whoever knew the path to their source held the key to untold riches. When the Dutch found themselves cut off from Portuguese ports, they had no sea charts, no navigators, and no navigational experience for voyages to the East Indies. All of this was carefully concealed. The Portuguese guarded their maps with manic obsession. Their loss could be punishable by death. They forbade hiring non-Catholic captains and sharing knowledge with foreigners. Yet, knowledge is an elusive thing. The Dutch began an espionage campaign. Their people lived for years in Lisbon disguised as merchants, navigators, and translators. They bribed, extracted information, and stole. They sought the legendary path to the southern seas. According to one story, plausible though unproven, disgruntled Jesuits themselves, dissatisfied with their Portuguese patrons, sold a set of maps to the Dutch. If this is indeed a legend, it is a beautiful one. In any case, one man changed everything. Cornelis de Houtman. This man didn't just obtain information, he assembled an expedition. In 1595, his fleet of 4 ships set sail for the East Indies. This was the first true Dutch attempt to break through to the Spice Islands. The sailors suffered from diseases, died of thirst, and mutinied. 2 ships sank, 1 disappeared. But 1 returned, bringing with it so much nutmeg, pepper, and cloves that the cargo sold for an incredible profit. This marked the beginning of a new era. And although de Houtman himself was later eaten by natives during one of his expeditions, his name remained in the annals as the man who opened the way to Java. And so, from the late 1590s, Dutch ships began to regularly depart for the East Indies. They established the first factory in the Sultanate of Bantam on Java. Spices literally grew everywhere there. The humid air, warm climate, and fertile soil, everything was favorable. Merchants bought bags of spices and sent them back to Amsterdam. As before, usually only 1 of 3 ships returned, but even that one brought such profit that it covered the costs of the entire fleet. Thus, a new economy of risk and super profit emerged. It was like a lottery, but one where winning brought not only money but also status, influence, and sometimes power on a scale comparable to royalty. It was during these years that real competition at sea began. The Portuguese and Dutch sank each other, captured ships, and burned warehouses. This was a war, but without fronts. If today's competition is about discounts and advertising, then back then it was about cannons, sabres, and hanged captains. Yet, the Dutch pressed forward. They managed to establish themselves not only in Indonesia but also to look further, towards Japan. In 1600, one of the first expeditions set off there, and on board was a navigator named William Adams, an Englishman hired by the Dutch for his maritime knowledge. He was the man who would turn the Japanese perception of Europe upside down and become the first European samurai. But more on him later, in a separate chapter. For now, all attention was focused on Java. Warehouses were built there, agreements were made with local sultans, and payments were made with goods and weapons. The Dutch understood the main thing: if you want to trade, first establish yourself, build a factory, bribe the ruler, protect yourself with cannons. And in these conditions, it became clear, many competing Dutch companies among themselves were inefficient. They hindered each other, drove down prices, and lost ships. And then the idea emerged to unite all efforts, to create one large organization that would deal exclusively with trade in the East Indies, with state support, with a fleet, army, its own laws, and, if necessary, its own currency. Thus, on the horizon, the VOC, Verenigde Oostindische Company, that is, the Dutch East India Company, began to take shape. But 2 more years remained until its official birth. And now, imagine an evening over Java, torches burning in the merchant's camp, bags of cinnamon neatly stacked in the hold, stars overhead, and navigators, by the light of a lantern, rechecking the maps, the very ones for which they spied, killed, and lost ships. They are looking for a path, and the path has already been found. Chapter 6: Japan and the Island of Dejima. History sometimes loves to take unexpected turns. It seems that everything is going according to plan: peaceful trade, spices, a fleet, ports. But suddenly, an English sailor appears on the scene, his ship is driven to the shores of Japan, and a random navigator becomes a samurai. This is not a figment of imagination or a myth, it's the story of William Adams. It all began in 1600, when a Dutch trading expedition, equipped to find new markets in Asia, reached the shores of Japan. It was one of those bold attempts when 5 ships, laden with hopes, goods, and sailors, set off into the unknown, guided only by the wind, stars, and fragmented rumors. On one of these ships, as a navigator, sailed William Adams, an Englishman hired by the Dutch for his knowledge of maritime affairs. The ships sailed along the coast for a long time. Some of them perished, others went off course. The remaining ship, exhausted, with a sick crew and almost no supplies, drifted to the Japanese shore. The sailors were arrested. The Europeans looked strange, spoke a foreign language, carried suspicious goods, and, in the opinion of local officials, could well have been pirates or spies. They were taken to Osaka, to the residence of the powerful shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu. From this moment, Adams' amazing story begins. He was interrogated. The Portuguese, who already had influence in Japan, actively began to slander the Dutch and English, claiming they were pirates, invaders, spreaders of Christianity, and a threat to Japanese stability. But Adams spoke reasonably. He talked about trade, about science, about nautical instruments. He didn't try to baptize the Japanese, and he didn't try to lie. His judiciousness pleased Tokugawa. Gradually, step by step, the navigator became the shogun's advisor, and then even a samurai. Yes, a European samurai, with a title, a house, a wife, and children. He couldn't return to Europe. He simply wasn't allowed to leave. But he wasn't eager to either. He wrote letters home, sent money to his first family in England, but lived a new, Japanese life. His name even gave a name to one of Tokyo's districts. Adams became a bridge between Europe and Japan. Through him, the Dutch began to build relations with the closed country. He was a window through which the East looked at the West, and vice versa. Meanwhile, the Portuguese were losing ground. Their Jesuit missionaries spread Christianity with considerable persistence. They built churches, taught locals, and incited rebellions. At some point, the Japanese felt that behind the missionary speeches lay an attempt to interfere in their internal affairs. When a major Christian rebellion broke out in Shimabara in 1637, the Japanese perceived it as a final threat. Shogun Tokugawa decided to isolate himself from the rest of the world. All Europeans, except the Dutch, were expelled, trade was forbidden, and missionaries were executed. The only exception was made for the VOC. Why? Because the Dutch did not try to convert to Christianity, did not interfere in politics, and did not build churches. They wanted to trade, simply and clearly. And this suited the Japanese. The Dutch were allowed to stay, but on one condition: they would not set foot on sacred Japanese soil. For this purpose, the artificial island of Dejima was built, in the shape of a fan dropped by the shogun. On this tiny piece of land stood warehouses, barracks, and an infirmary. The Dutch were only allowed to trade and reside there. They couldn't enter the city, marry Japanese women, and children born from relationships with locals were taken away upon reaching a certain age. Control was total. But this island was golden. Even despite the restrictions, the Dutch earned huge sums of money: silver, porcelain, Tonkin silk, lacquered goods, and tea. By some estimates, profits from trade with Japan reached 45,000%, not annually, but from a single voyage. And all this became possible because once, an English navigator, not a Spaniard, not a Portuguese, not a missionary, spoke calmly, confidently, without preaching, and was heard. And somewhere on the other side of Asia, at the same time, a wave of unification was rising. The Dutch understood. This couldn't go on. All these expeditions, scattered factories, competition among themselves. Too many losses, too little control. One structure was needed, one force, one company. Chapter 7. The birth of a corporation with an army and fleet. Sometimes it seems that the history of corporations began quite recently, with offices in glass skyscrapers, presentations on stock exchanges, with logos and shares. But long before Apple, Google, and Amazon, long before investment funds and boards of directors, in 1602, the first truly transnational, capitalist, armed, corporate empire appeared in Northern Europe. It was called the Verenigde Oostindische Company, or VOC for short, the Dutch East India Company. This was not just a merchant association. It was a new format of power. The emergence of the VOC became a turning point not only in the history of trade, but also in the history of governance, finance, and even colonialism. To understand how revolutionary it was, one needs to imagine the following facts. First, the company had a monopoly right to trade with the East. This meant that no other Dutch organization, no merchant, no independent adventurer had the right to conduct business in the East Indies. Everything went through the VOC. Second, the company was subordinate to the state but was managed by private investors. The main oversight was exercised by the States General, the Parliament of the young Dutch Republic, but real power was held by the Council of 17 Lords, the wealthiest merchant families in the country. Third, The VOC had the right to mint its own currency, conclude international treaties, build fortresses, negotiate with monarchs, declare wars, and maintain an army and a fleet. That is, it practically possessed all the rights of a sovereign state. The world had never seen such a hybrid of business and power. But there was something else, something that made the VOC a truly epoch-making structure: shares. Yes, right here, in 1602, in Amsterdam, the first stock exchange in history appeared. VOC shares could be bought, sold, and inherited. They were bearer shares. Anyone with money, from an aristocrat to a wealthy artisan, could invest in the company and receive a share of the profits. The revenues, by the way, were astronomical. Within a couple of years, the shares rose by over 100%, and then even more. Initially, dividends were paid in spices, literally bags of pepper, cloves, and saffron. Later, they switched to money. And this was not just investing. It was participation in a global transformation. By buying a VOC share, you essentially became an accomplice in an expedition, the capture of a fort, the establishment of a monopoly, the blockade of a strait. Your dividends smelled of the colony. All this happened even before Newton formulated the law of universal gravitation, before America became independent, before the Napoleonic Wars, before the Industrial Revolution. The VOC was capitalism in its purest form, only under sails and with cannons. The company quickly began to expand across Asia. Its ships sailed to China, Japan, Ceylon, to the coasts of India, to the islands of Indonesia. They established factories, forts, garrisons. And if someone refused to trade, an army arrived. A private army. Yes, the VOC was the first in the world to create what we today call a private military company, PMC. Moreover, these were not just mercenaries. It was a real system with a charter, hierarchy, and discipline. VOC soldiers fought against the Portuguese, local sultans, and pirates, and in some cases, against the British. They didn't just escort caravans. They conquered territories, established regimes, built fortresses, and suppressed rebellions. The VOC army sometimes outnumbered the regular armies of European states of that time. The company's fleet was also impressive. In various years, the VOC fleet numbered up to 150 merchant ships and up to 40 warships. It was an entire maritime world, a flotilla cruising between ports, transporting spices, silver, slaves, porcelain, tea, textiles, and weapons. And at the center of all this was the logo, the world's first corporate logo, which was printed on merchandise boxes, ship flags, and documents. A simple, clear letter V, intertwined with O and C. To this day, it looks concise and modern. Even in this, the VOC was ahead of its time. The Dutch East India Company became more than just a merchant association. It became a superstructure, a new form of empire in which money was more important than origin, and profit was more important than the crown. It was a model of the future that came too early, or perhaps just in time. While Europe debated faith and kings, the VOC was already calculating profitability and investing in military expeditions. It is from this moment that one can date the heyday of the VOC empire, and with it, the beginning of the European colonial order in Asia. But to retain wealth, shares and ships alone are not enough. One must conquer, subdue, and reshape the world to one's will. And this will be undertaken by the next hero of our story, a man whose name became a symbol of Dutch colonialism. Chapter 8: The Exchange, Shares, and Profit from Spices. When the VOC began operating at full capacity, Europe saw for the first time what super profit meant on a scale exceeding even the wildest fantasies. These weren't just successful trading voyages. These were operations in which every clove, every speck of nutmeg literally turned into gold. Imagine a ship returning from the East Indies, laden to the brim with spices, silk, and Chinese porcelain. It's greeted like a ship returning from El Dorado. Its hold is a treasure chest, only without diamonds, but with tons of pepper. And this profit is tangible, fragrant, spilling through your fingers. In 1603, one of the VOC's officers, Admiral Jacob van Heemskerk, captured a Portuguese merchant ship named the Santa Catarina off the coast of Singapore. It wasn't just a ship, it was a floating palace, packed with porcelain, silk, and silver from China. The VOC sold its cargo in Amsterdam and earned a sum equivalent to 3.5 million guilders. To give you a sense of scale, the Admiral received 1 million as personal income from just one voyage. The understanding of such profits spread quickly. Merchants eagerly invested in VOC shares. They sold like hotcakes. The initial cost of one share was 3,000 guilders, an enormous sum. But within a few years, the shares rose in price by 130%, and then even more. This was the first real stock market boom in world history. Initially, dividends were paid in the form of spices. You literally received a bag of pepper, cloves, and a little saffron. Later, they switched to monetary payments. And this was not just investing, it was participating in a global transformation. By buying a VOC share, you essentially became an accomplice in an expedition, the capture of a fort, the establishment of a monopoly, and the blockade of a strait. Your dividends smelled of the colony. At the same time, the VOC was establishing itself on Java, Sumatra, Bantam, and Ambon. Factories were founded there, warehouses and fortress walls were built. And each new fortification was a step towards complete monopoly. The Dutch didn't just want to participate in the spice market, they wanted to own the entire market. It was for this very purpose that the political, military, and economic infrastructure was built. Garrisons appeared in ports, customs houses were established, and VOC ships patrolled the coast, seizing anything not flying their flag. It was during this time that the Dutch also reached Calcutta, the capital of Oriental luxury. There they saw not bags of pepper, but sapphires, emeralds, gold, and ivory. A factory was also established there, and another story began, the story of the VOC's immersion in India and into what the English would later transform into the British Empire. But the Dutch were the first. However, with wealth came danger. This entire ocean was now overflowing with rivals. The Portuguese tried to reclaim what they had lost, while the English, on the contrary, increased their influence. And every ship sent to the East Indies might not return. 1 out of 3 ships would perish in a storm, from illness, or as a result of a pirate attack. But the remaining 2 still paid for everything handsomely. And this was a unique characteristic of the VOC. They even calculated this. The company developed a mathematical risk model that allowed them to insure cargo. Operations were calculated down to the percentage probability of a ship's loss and the quantity of spices sold. This was not just an adventurous voyage, it was a cold business, precise and ruthless. And all of this was done for bags of pepper. But in those bags was much more than just spices. There was money, power, control, influence, strategy, and even ideology. The VOC at this time became a real machine. It knew no mercy, felt no doubts. It opened new routes, seized new markets, integrated Europe into Asia and vice versa. It changed the very essence of world trade. But this machine needed a man who would take control, a man who would transform the chaos of factories and ships into an empire. Such a man was approaching, and his name was Jan Pietersoen Cohen. Chapter 9: Batavia, or How to Build a Capital in the Jungle. If the VOC was an empire, then it needed a capital. Not a temporary factory, not a fort with a flag on the tower, not a tent with bags of pepper, but a real center of power, administration, trade, and logistics. And this center emerged not in The Hague, not in Amsterdam, but in the very heart of Indonesia, on the island of Java. It was named Batavia, and it was built by a man whose name became almost legendary, Jan Pietersoen Cohen. Cohen is a multifaceted figure. He was not just an administrator, he was an organizer, a military strategist, and, without any exaggeration, the architect of the VOC as a political organism. He understood that scattered factories would not maintain a monopoly, that the chaos of trading posts had to give way to a strict system. And he began to build this system from a land that had nothing but swamps, jungles, and hostile tribes. A factory, or factorage in Dutch, was a trading settlement or fortified warehouse that European powers established in their colonies. Merchants lived there, goods were stored, and deals were made with locals. Simply put, it was an operational base for overseas trade. So, in 1619, Cohen chose the site for a new base, a small port called Jayakarta, owned by a local sultan. It was located at a strategic point in northwestern Java, ideally suited for controlling sea routes. There was only one problem. The city was already occupied, and the sultan had no intention of giving it up. Cohen's solution was simple and, alas, characteristic of the era: assault and burning. The city was razed to the ground. Its inhabitants were expelled or annihilated. In its place, Cohen ordered the establishment of a new capital, Batavia, named after the ancient Germanic tribe of the Batavians, from whom the Dutch believed they originated. This was a symbolic act, a European nation building a new civilization on the other side of the world. And indeed, Batavia quickly became a showcase of Dutch dominance. Canals appeared there, like in Amsterdam, stone warehouses, paved streets, markets, a harbour, and fortress walls. The city was divided into districts, one for the Dutch, another for Chinese merchants, a third for slaves. Everything was strictly ordered, clear, geometric, just like the entire VOC system. Batavia housed the Governor-General, the highest VOC official in Asia. Here, orders were written, deals were concluded, and disobedient individuals were tried. Batavia became the heart of the corporation, the place from which all Asian operations were managed, from Ceylon to Japan, from India to Banda. But the beauty of the city was built on blood. To create Batavia, it was necessary not only to win but also to hold. Locals rebelled, nature resisted, swamps reluctantly yielded land, and malaria claimed hundreds of lives. Slaves were brought by the thousands from Africa, Madagascar, and Borneo. Batavia shone, but beneath its cobblestones lay the bones of thousands of people whose names no one remembered. Cohen, nevertheless, continued the work. He subjugated neighboring cities, established diplomatic relations with the Japanese, and eliminated competition in the region. His approach was simple: if an agreement could be reached, great; if not, they would come with cannons. He did not believe in long-term alliances but believed in the power of fear and control. And it worked. Under his leadership, the VOC reached new heights. The sums passing through Batavia amounted to millions of guilders. Ships arrived and departed weekly. From here, caravans of porcelain, silk, tea, opium, coffee, and tobacco were sent. Batavia became a logistical marvel of the 17th century, a global distribution center connecting East and West. And yet it was a ghost town, a scarred city. Beneath its polished surface lay fear, death, and strict segregation by race, religion, and origin. The Dutch lived separately, the Chinese separately, the locals even further apart. Slaves were not allowed on the streets after sunset, and punishments for rebellion or escape were barbaric. This was an order built on hierarchy and discipline. Nevertheless, Batavia functioned. And as long as it lived, so did the VOC. Because without this capital, without its harbor, its warehouse, its treasury, everything else would have crumbled. It was here that the corporation reached its maturity. It was here that its ideology was born: control, calculation, distance. Everything that would come later, gold, war, slavery, diplomacy, all began here. And meanwhile, the sun rose over the city, reflecting in the canals built in the image of Amsterdam. Ships hummed in the harbor, dividends grew, and it seemed that nothing could shake this colonial machine. But even a perfect system falters, especially when it comes to people, especially when profit is more important than conscience. Chapter 10: Spices and Cannons. The Banda Islands Massacre. Monopoly, a word that sounds dry and encyclopedic. But behind it lie thousands of bodies, rivers of blood, and cities that have vanished from the face of the earth. The Dutch East India Company, having reached maturity, decided to cement its position not merely through markets or treaties, but through complete control over the very sources of spices. And the first item on that list was the Banda Archipelago. The Banda Islands are a few tiny dots on the map, lost in the Molucca Sea. They are minuscule, but it was here, at that time, that 100% of the world's nutmeg grew. No other region could offer this pungent, oily, intoxicating fruit. If you held Banda, you held the entire global nutmeg market. And the Dutch understood this. Initially, the VOC tried to act civilly. Representatives of the company negotiated with local rajas, concluded treaties, and agreed on exclusive supplies. But the islanders, who had traded with Arabs, Chinese, Portuguese, and even English for centuries, were in no hurry to surrender to the mercy of a single company. They refused to give all their harvest solely to the Dutch. They continued to trade on the side. For the VOC, this was unacceptable. In 1621, under the leadership of Jan Pietersoen Cohen, a punitive expedition was organized. A detachment of several hundred armed soldiers arrived from Batavia, joined by Japanese mercenaries. Terror began. The Dutch landed on the islands one by one. Villages were burned, men were seized and tortured, demanding confessions of smuggling. Women and children were enslaved. The Rajas, the traditional leaders of the islands, were ordered to be hanged or publicly beheaded. All of this was accompanied by the formalization of supposedly legal contracts for the transfer of all lands to the VOC. According to modern estimates, up to 90% of the island's population was exterminated through massacre, famine, flight, and subsequent epidemics. The few who survived were turned into laborers on the plantations, which were now under the complete control of the VOC. Thus began monoculture, the practice of growing only one product, in this case, nutmeg. This allowed the company to control the entire harvest, all supplies, and all prices. The East India Company no longer competed. It became the sole owner of everything. It now considered both the land, the people, and the spices themselves as its property. For logistics and security, fortresses were built on the islands, garrisons were created, and slaves were imported from other regions because there were simply no locals left. Production proceeded under supervision, and any act of disobedience was punished by death. Spices were now obtained not only by hand but also by blood. Meanwhile, in Europe, all that remained of these horrors were thin jars of powder in the kitchens of the aristocracy. A little grated nutmeg in wine, and the evening became exquisite. No one thought that behind that pinch lay burned villages and forgotten peoples. The sweet scent of nutmeg concealed the bitterness of ash. From the VOC's perspective, the operation was successful. Control over the nutmeg market became absolute, profits stable, and its reputation fearsome. The other islands and merchants understood. Resistance would be punished not with fines, but with extermination. Later, when the British eventually reached one of the Banda Islands, Run, and even briefly captured it, this would become a point for future negotiations. The VOC would want this patch of land back and would exchange it for the island of Manhattan. But more on that later. For now, silence reigns on Banda, not of peace, but of the absence of people. Spices ripened, were packed, sent to Batavia, and from there to Amsterdam. And again to the markets, again to the banks, again to shareholder reports. And again dividends, only without mentioning how many heads those percentages cost. This was the price of monopoly. And this was only the first reckoning with the counterparties. Ahead lay Formosa, Ceylon, India, the Cape Colony. And everywhere, according to the same scheme. Chapter 11, East, West, and a Drop of Blood. How the VOC divided the world with Britain. In the 17th century, the planet was rapidly shrinking. The seas contracted under sails, shores drew ever closer, and the main players understood. Land is a finite resource, and if you want a monopoly, you'll have to defend or buy it. Thus, the Dutch East India Company clashed with another power, equally ambitious, equally greedy, equally predatory, the British East India Company, established just 2 years earlier. Initially, their paths rarely crossed. The British entrenched themselves in India, while the Dutch focused on the Moluccas and Southeast Asia. But as their trading empires grew, their spheres of influence began to overlap. And then it became clear, two predators couldn't feed on the same archipelago. The situation became particularly tense on the aforementioned Banda Islands, where in 1616 the English occupied the island of Run, a tiny, but with the richest nutmeg plantations. The VOC fiercely fought for the return of the island, imposing blockades, sending landing parties, and conducting negotiations. The English held on stubbornly. Decades later, after a series of conflicts, raids, and diplomatic maneuvers, the companies realized that constant warfare was unprofitable. It was not only expensive but also futile. Ships sank, markets were lost, profits fell. And so, in 1667, the Treaty of Breda was concluded, an agreement that would later be called one of the most astonishing in geopolitical history. Under its terms, Holland permanently received the island of Run, and in return, ceded Manhattan Island to Britain. Yes, that very Manhattan, a small Dutch settlement named New Amsterdam, passed into British hands, and they, in turn, renamed it New York, in honor of the Duke of York, the future King James II. The deal, at first glance, seems strange, but if viewed through the eyes of 17th-century people, it was absolutely logical. Run gave control over nutmeg, while Manhattan was just a cold, damp patch of land off the coast of North America where almost no one lived and nothing grew. Some saw it as a colonial burden, others as gold on a nutmeg branch. History judged otherwise. New York became the capital of the world, while the island of Run almost disappeared from the map of importance. But then, in 1667, the VOC considered itself the victor. It had achieved a complete monopoly on nutmeg. Control was absolute. The spice brought tens of thousands of % in profit. Shares soared, and stock exchanges rejoiced. In parallel, the Dutch signed another important agreement with the English on mutual non-interference in their zones of influence. India went to the British, the East Indies to the VOC. Formally, it was peace. In reality, it was a division of the world. Companies became global political actors. Not kings, not parliaments, not republics, but exactly joint stock companies began to determine which territories would develop, which would suffocate, where roads would be built, and where plantations would burn. This was a new era, an era of corporate imperialism. But behind this peaceful agreement, as always, lay blood. Because to own an island, one had to not just sign a treaty, but to hold it, to subdue the locals, to destroy competitors, to bribe chiefs, to bring in slaves. And both companies, the VOC and the British EIC, did this with the same cold-bloodedness. They did not build temples, they did not bring religion, they did not read manifestos. They built factories, flotillas, and warehouses. And instead of sacred scriptures, they carried barrels of gunpowder and stacks of contracts. This was the colonial world, built not on ideas, but on goods, percentages, balance sheets, and logistics. Its heart was in the reports, its soul in the accounting. And in this world, the VOC felt right at home. It got everything it wanted: spices, islands, treaties, shares. All that remained was to hold on. But holding on, as history shows, always costs more than conquering. And in the next chapter, we will look into the shadow of this dominance, to the island of Formosa, where the VOC tried to build a new model of governance and encountered unexpected resistance. Chapter 12. Taiwan, which did not yield. Sometimes even the most powerful structure, even the most calculating empire, suffers defeat. Not because of enemies, not because of calamities, but simply because the world refuses to submit completely. Such a place for the Dutch East India Company was the island that on ancient maps was listed as Formosa, which in Portuguese means beautiful. Today, we know it as Taiwan. The first Europeans reached the shores of Taiwan in the early 17th century. The Portuguese, as usual, gave it a name and sailed on. The Spanish briefly settled in the north, but the main player became the VOC, which landed in the southwest of the island in 1624. The Dutch quickly built Fort Zeelandia, named after a Dutch province. It became the administrative center of their new colony. The idea was simple. Taiwan was a strategic point between China, Japan, and the Philippines. A convenient harbor, fertile lands, potential trade with the mainland. But there was one nuance: the local tribes. And another nuance: China. The Dutch, unwilling to repeat the full extent of Indonesian brutalities, decided to act cunningly. They began a missionary and educational program, hired locals for the police, taught them the Dutch language, conducted village inventories, and imposed taxes. Taiwan became an experiment in colonization not by bayonets, but by bureaucracy and cultural pressure. On paper, it looked good; in reality, not so much. The tribes didn't want to pay, submit, pray, learn, or work for foreigners. The resistance wasn't frontal, but it slowly eroded the VOC's structure from within. Assassinations of officials, arsons, escapes. And most importantly, economic instability. Revenues from the island were low, expenses constant. But the worst was yet to come. In 1661, a man landed on Taiwan who became a nightmare for the Dutch: Zhang Chenggong, also known as Koxinga, a semi-legendary Chinese pirate, patriot, and military leader who declared war on the Manchu Qing dynasty but decided to first capture the VOC base on Taiwan. He had 25,000 men and dozens of ships. The Dutch had about 2,000, half of whom were local or poorly trained. The siege of Zeelandia lasted 9 months. The garrison suffered from hunger, disease, and lack of supplies. Reinforcements from Batavia did not arrive. Too far, too expensive, too late. In 1662, After a grueling siege, the Dutch surrendered. This was the first major defeat of the VOC in Asia. Formosa ceased to be a colony. It never brought the company much money, did not become a logistical hub, and did not submit to either arms or bureaucracy. Xing Chenggong transformed Taiwan into his own state, albeit for several decades. And the VOC lost face. In Batavia, there was a scandal. The Governor-General was accused of incompetence, shareholders lost millions, and the reputation was undermined. But the most interesting thing is this. Formosa showed that even a giant, even a corporate behemoth, even the VOC, could suffer defeat if it relied too heavily on schemes and underestimated the strength of local will. Taiwan was not Banda. Here it was not possible to wipe everyone out and start anew. Here was an enemy equal in strength and persistence. This was a crack in the hull of the ship on which the VOC sailed, unnoticed but ominous, showing that not everything is subject to market and muskets, loyalty cannot be bought everywhere, and not everyone can be intimidated. After Taiwan, the company continued to expand, but the shadow of this defeat already lay over future expeditions. In Ceylon, in India, in Bengal, they did not surrender, but their confidence was no longer the same. And history, as we know, does not forgive weakness, even temporary. Chapter 13. Ceylon and the Cinnamon Tax. If the island of Banda gave the VOC a monopoly on nutmeg, then the next step was cinnamon, another spice considered almost mystical in Europe. It was used not only in cooking but also in medicine, perfumery, and religious rituals. It symbolized wealth, health, and power. And the source of the best cinnamon in the world is the island of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka. Initially, the VOC did not seriously claim the island. The Portuguese were already there, having established their forts and alliances with local rulers. But after the expulsion of the Portuguese from the Moluccas, the Dutch realized Ceylon was the next logical step. They began to act cautiously, but methodically. First diplomacy, then forts, then the army. By 1658, the Portuguese were finally pushed out, and the island came under VOC control. And here began the spicy bureaucracy. The company didn't just station a garrison. It created a cinnamon tax system, almost the first fiscal model in history based on a plant. Every village, every collector, every cinnamon bush was accounted for, registered, and controlled. The local population was obliged to submit a certain amount of bark per year. If the norm was not met, punishments followed, sometimes in the form of corporal punishment. The plantations themselves were supervised directly from Batavia. Cinnamon inspectors were introduced to check quality, harvest times, and the condition of the bushes. Production was organized on the principle of nothing superfluous, only the necessary quantity, only the necessary variety, everything else was uprooted. This was monoculture in its ideal embodiment. And the VOC stripped tens of thousands of % in profits from it. Ceylon quickly became the company's second heart after Batavia. Supplies to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa passed through it. And parallel to cinnamon, slavery began to actively develop. Workers were brought to the plantations from Madagascar, India, and Indonesia. They were not taught how to collect bark, they were simply lined up and forced. But, surprisingly, the local Sinhalese proved to be a more complex partner than planned. They weren't tribes, they had their own culture, religion, and knowledge of the terrain. And despite the occupation, they constantly rebelled, attacked warehouses, and carried out sabotage. The Kingdom of Kandy, located in the mountains, especially resisted and was never fully subdued by either the Portuguese or the VOC. Periodically, the Dutch would conduct campaigns against Kandy, sign temporary agreements, retreat, and return. This was a simmering war in which no one definitively won. But in the VOC's accounting books, everything looked stable. Supplies were coming in, profits were flowing, spices were loaded into barrels. Ceylon became another example of how the VOC was able to integrate a territory into its corporate structure without necessarily owning it completely. They didn't try to convert locals to Christianity or build European cities. They simply took the goods and sent them on. Everything else was an expense, especially human lives. Cinnamon from Ceylon was supplied to Europe under strict control. It was packaged, weighed, and sold at auctions. Each batch had its own stamp, its own number. It was a commodity almost equivalent to currency. At the same time, the VOC actively propagated in Europe, creating an image of exotic distant lands where valiant merchants civilized wild peoples. In reality, everything came down to a scheme: take, export, sell, divide. And cinnamon, with its delicate scent and thin bark, became a symbol of this duplicity of colonialism, a spicy wrapper for a system built on coercion. But even cinnamon could not mask the main problem. The VOC had become too large, too expensive to manage, and too dependent on colonial wars. And as long as the spices flowed, everything worked. But as soon as they slowed down, the mechanism began to creak. Ceylon remained profitable, but unstable. And then came other territories, even more dangerous and unpredictable. Chapter 14: Dejima, Japan's Window to Europe. If VOC colonialism in Indonesia and Ceylon was built on bayonets, cannons, and taxes, then in Japan, the Dutch had to change their tune. Here, it was impossible to use force. There were no familiar schemes. Japan was a closed world. And in this world, the Dutch were allocated a small, tiny, but exceptionally important island, Dejima. In the 17th century, Japan entered a special era of its history, the Edo period, governed by the Tokugawa shogunate. It was an era of stability, order, and isolation. Japan almost completely closed its borders, prohibiting foreigners from entering and Japanese from leaving. Violations were punishable by death. The entire outside world became a dangerous virus for the Japanese, one that needed to be kept under control. Nevertheless, they were willing to let something in, especially if it brought profit. Therefore, in 1641, the only European nation allowed to trade with Japan was not the Portuguese, not the Spanish, and not the English, but precisely the Dutch from the VOC. Why? It was simple. The VOC agreed to play by Japanese rules. No missionaries, no cross, no claims on souls. Only goods, only business relations, only minimal interference. And Japan appreciated this cold respect for its borders. The Dutch were settled on the artificial island of Dejima, approximately 120 meters long and 75 meters wide, in the harbor of Nagasaki. It was a trading cage with gates, guards, and a bridge leading to the mainland. The Dutch were not allowed to go outside, not allowed to bring women, and required to observe Japanese customs. They were inspected, monitored, and interrogated. This was trade under total control. But in return, the VOC gained a monopoly on the entire Japanese market. Through Dejima, goods flowed: medical books, astronomical instruments, firearms, furs, glass, alcohol, textiles, anatomy, and botany books. And in the opposite direction, silver, copper, lacquerware, porcelain, teas, and silk. These supplies brought less profit than spices, but they had exceptional value for Europe. The Dutch became the only window into Japanese civilization. Through them, knowledge about Japanese medicine, languages, and culture entered Europe. It was the VOC that created the first Japanese-Dutch dictionary. It was through them that Japan studied Western science, called Rangaku, Dutch learning. Every arrival of a VOC ship became an event. Dutch captains and residents reported to the shogun, brought gifts, and held receptions. This was trade as diplomacy, carefully calibrated, with minimal presence but maximum output. And what is astonishing, no other European state had such a permanent channel of communication with Japan for almost 200 years. While the English and French broke into other countries with cannons, the VOC simply followed instructions. It didn't build empires, but it built a bridge. For Japan, this was convenient. They received the necessary technologies, remained isolated, and maintained the illusion of complete closure. For the VOC, it brought prestige, status, and a stable flow of rare goods. And although the trade volumes were more modest than in Ceylon or Java, the political and cultural significance of Dejima was gigantic. The Dutch proved that they could be not only conquerors but also quiet observers if the situation demanded it. This unique balance held until the mid-19th century, when the Americans arrived and opened Japan by force. But until then, the VOC and Dejima were linked like secret allies, living in trust, restrictions, and polite calculation. This was an unusual chapter of colonialism, where there was no shooting or slaughter, where they simply sat on a small island and waited. But they waited with profit. Chapter 15. Bengal and the Failure in India. India is often associated with the British, and rightly so. The British East India Company firmly established itself on the subcontinent, turning it into the heart of its colonial empire. But before Britain finally captured Bengal, other flags had already touched its shores, and among them, the flag of the VOC. The Dutch East India Company came to India with the same goal it had in Indonesia: to obtain goods, build factories, organize logistics, and extract profits. But if in Java and Ceylon they had to clear jungles and subdue tribes, in India everything was different. Here, empires already existed. There were complex political alliances, extensive trade networks, and players who knew the price of any agreement. The VOC's first presence in India began in the Bengal region, which was then part of the Mughal Empire. It was a storehouse of textiles, indigo, rice, opium, and salt. Bengali cotton, thin, light, almost transparent like a spiderweb, was especially famous. In Europe, it became a luxurious commodity. The Dutch established factories in Chinchura, Patna, Kasimbaza, and Berhampur. They concluded agreements with local nawabs, rulers of districts, and traded directly, bypassing competitors. On paper, everything looked good. Goods flowed, warehouses filled up, and ships departed for Batavia and Amsterdam. But India was a different beast. Here, you couldn't just land and declare yourself the owner. Here, the game was played among the Mughals, French, British, Marathas, Sikhs, and countless internal factions. The Dutch had to maneuver, negotiate, endure losses, and, most importantly, constantly lose the initiative. In the mid-18th century, everything became more complicated. The British grew stronger. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the British East India Company effectively became the ruling power in Bengal. The Dutch tried to intervene. In 1759, they sent an armed expedition to regain influence and overthrow the British. This led to the Battle of Baidera, a little-known but important event. The result was catastrophic. The British routed the Dutch, their troops were captured, and their ships were sunk. The VOC lost not only its military position but also its reputation. From then on, their presence in India began to steadily decline. Their factories closed, agreements were terminated, and warehouses emptied. The VOC's problem in India was systemic. The company acted as a trading mechanism, unable to adapt to a new reality, a reality where it was necessary not just to buy and sell, but to govern, intrigue, conquer, and hold territory. The British understood this and implemented an administrative machine, an army, and diplomacy. The Dutch tried to do everything the old way and lost. Unlike Batavia or Ceylon, where the VOC could dictate terms, in Bengal it always remained a guest on borrowed time. And when the wind of change blew harder, this guest was simply shown the door. Bengal became the frontier beyond which the Dutch East India Company could no longer compete on equal terms. It did not disappear but became secondary. And this was the beginning of the end. Ahead for the VOC was its last big bet, the Cape Colony in South Africa, where it was still possible to build from scratch. Chapter 16: The VOC's Last Bet, the Cape Colony. At the southern tip of Africa, where the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean, lies the Cape of Good Hope. For VOC ships traveling from Europe to the East Indies, this place was not just a geographical marker, it was a moment of truth. Here, it was decided whether they would reach spices, gold, and glory, or end up feeding the sharks. The journey was long, difficult, and exhausting. Therefore, at some point, the corporation needed a reliable staging post. Thus, the Cape Colony emerged. In 1652, the Dutch sailor Jan van Riebeek, on behalf of the VOC, established a factory in the bay near the Cape. The area was harsh but promising: fertile soil, fresh water, a convenient harbour, and, most importantly, the opportunity to create what had long been lost in Asia, a territory that could be developed from scratch, without competitors, without old agreements, without resistance from major empires. The Cape Colony was initially conceived as a logistical hub, a place where ships could replenish water supplies, undergo repairs, and wait out storms. But gradually, it became something more. Boer farmers, predominantly from Holland, but also from Germany and France, began to settle there. They raised livestock, grew grapes, and built houses in the Dutch style. Within a few decades, a new world emerged on the edge of Africa, a colony with European laws, language, and customs. But there was also a dark side. The local peoples, the Khoikhoi, San, and Hottentots, found themselves in a situation familiar from other regions. They were displaced, enslaved, and turned into laborers. As in the East Indies, the VOC did not shy away from using slave labor. Moreover, slaves were brought not only from Africa but also from India, Indonesia, and even Madagascar. The Cape Colony quickly transformed into an ethnically diverse but deeply hierarchical system. The Dutch at the top, everyone else at the bottom. The company itself profited from the trade in wine, meat, hides, and ship servicing. Kaapstad, modern-day Cape Town, became a strategic hub, somewhat like a gas station for the VOC empire. But even despite the importance of this colony, it could not save the company from the general crisis. While the Cape Colony developed, the VOC lost influence in Asia. The British and French pushed it out of India, trade in Japan almost ceased, and rebellions flared up in Ceylon. Management became increasingly inefficient, and corruption ate away at the remnants of discipline. Even giants can fall, especially if their structure is built on resource extraction rather than adaptation. The Cape Colony would endure for a long time. First under VOC control, then transferred to the British, and later becoming the cradle of the white population of South Africa. But for the VOC, it remained the final attempt to fix everything, a gamble on a reboot, a beginning that could not stop the end. Today's Cape Town grew precisely from this VOC outpost. A city where Europe, Africa, and Asia intersected, it began with a small fortification at the Cape. A history etched in geography. Chapter 17. Opium, the company's shadow commodity. When one speaks of the Dutch East India Company, the imagination conjures up holds full of nutmeg, cinnamon, and pepper. But there is another commodity, dark, quiet, taboo, that brought the company stable income and left far more long-lasting consequences. We are talking about opium. The VOC began trading opium practically from its inception. Opium was cultivated in India, especially in the regions of Bengal and Bihar, where the climate allowed for stable harvests. Initially, it was intended for medicinal purposes, but it quickly became clear the demand for it was much wider and much more dangerous. China became the key market. Contrary to modern stereotypes, the first major supplier of opium to China was not the British, but precisely the Dutch. The VOC sold Indian opium to Chinese intermediaries, who then distributed it within the country. This was a contraband market, officially prohibited by imperial decrees, but flourishing under the cover of officials, traders, and pirates. Opium brought immediate and sustained profits. It was light in weight, concentrated in value, did not spoil in transit, and caused physical addiction, meaning stable demand. For the VOC, it was an ideal commodity during periods when spice supplies declined or market prices fell. The company built a complex logistics system. Indian opium was transported to South China through trading centers in Malacca, Batavia, and Formosa. Unmarked vessels were used, and deals were conducted through dummy agents. All of this allowed the VOC to maintain the facade of a respectable trading society, without publicizing what was actually loaded into the holds. Interestingly, the Dutch themselves never made opium a central commodity. It was more of an insurance buffer, a means of financing other operations. But at the same time, it had a disproportionately large impact on the VOC's economy and moral perception in the eyes of some peoples, especially the Chinese. Later, in the 19th century, when the British East India Company would make opium its main export to China, the Opium Wars would begin, the Qing dynasty would fall, and China would be dismembered. But the first scars on the body of the Celestial Empire were left by the VOC. In Holland itself, they preferred to remain silent about the opium trade. It wasn't included in engravings of ships, wasn't mentioned in poems about spices, and didn't appear in reports for shareholders. But in drafts, in cargo documents, in secret instructions, opium was there. It was transported, it was sold, it was counted on. Historians today evaluate the scale of this trade as moderate, but regular and stable. Opium became an economic glue, allowing the VOC to maintain its fleet, finance garrisons, and cover losses from spice crop failures or unsuccessful trading missions. And, like much in the history of the VOC, this commodity became a symbol of ambivalence. The corporation, considered the pinnacle of rationality, civilization, and commercial genius, ran one of the first organized international drug trafficking schemes, long before cartels and underground syndicates. And it was this quiet, unnoticed trade that, perhaps, was one of the reasons why the Chinese later chose to close themselves off from the entire West, and the name European merchant became synonymous not with trust, but with poisoning. Chapter 18. The demise of the VOC and its legacy in history. At some point, it seems as if the machine will run forever, that profits will flow endlessly, that spices will never run out, ships won't sink, officials won't become corrupt, and shareholders won't revolt. But history laughs at these expectations, because any empire, no matter how rational, sooner or later faces the costs of growth. The Dutch East India Company, VOC, became the wealthiest corporation in human history by the end of the 18th century. Its assets, when converted to modern currency, were valued in the tens of trillions of dollars. It was the world's first structure to combine colonialism, trade, diplomacy, military force, and the stock exchange into a single system. The VOC was not just a corporation, it was a state without a nation. However, from the late 18th century onwards, the mechanism began to falter. Firstly, management. A network of dozens of factories, colonies, garrisons, and ports required a huge administrative apparatus. The further its territory stretched, the more time it took to make decisions, and the more corruption flourished. Local officials turned into rulers pursuing personal gain. Secondly, competition. The British East India Company became increasingly aggressive and successful. France, Denmark, Spain, and Portugal all tried to seize the initiative. China and Japan tightened trade conditions. Indian markets fell under British control. The VOC lost share after share. Thirdly, profit. Spices were no longer a rarity. Nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper, all became readily available commodities. And when a commodity ceases to be a luxury, it ceases to be super profitable. Prices fell, and maintaining the colonies became more expensive than the profits they yielded. The VOC was no longer earning, it was surviving. By the early 19th century, the situation became critical. The company held on only by its old authority and financial injections from the mother country. Debts accumulated, shareholders were dissatisfied, and society was changing. The Age of Enlightenment did not favor semi-military monopolies acting like a pirate fleet under an accountant's flag. In 1799, the VOC was officially dissolved. All its assets, debts, possessions, and documents were transferred to the state, the Batavian Republic, created in the French-occupied Netherlands. In essence, the Dutch East India Company ceased to exist, dissolving in the storm of revolutions and geopolitical shifts. But here's what's striking: Holland as a country benefited. Despite the collapse of the VOC, its centuries of profits fueled the country's economy, finances, culture, and architecture. Amsterdam became the banking center of Europe, its stock exchange a model to imitate, and the Dutch bourgeoisie one of the most enlightened and wealthiest in the world. The VOC created an infrastructure of wealth on which the Netherlands stood for another century. Yes, then came the Napoleonic Wars, the loss of colonies, German invasions. But the trace of the VOC did not disappear. And to this day, in Amsterdam, The Hague, and Rotterdam, you can find buildings constructed with spices and dividends. In a broader sense, the VOC became the prototype of the modern corporation. It was with it that joint stock companies with public share offerings began, along with international logistics and standardized trade routes, the interaction of corporations with governments, and the idea that business could wage war and maintain an army. And most importantly, the feeling that money governs states, not the other way around. This was an economic revolution, no less important than the industrial one. The VOC did not just deliver spices, it redefined the very nature of power. And, however bitter it may be, the VOC's path became a warning that an immeasurable thirst for profit, combined with violence and exploitation, ultimately destroys the very structure built in such a way. The VOC died, but its shadow still hovers in the head offices of multinational corporations, at container terminals, in offshore zones, in logos and dividends. The spices ran out, the profits faded, the VOC perished, but the global system changed forever. Thank you for joining us on this journey following the footsteps of the most powerful trading empire of the past. In another lecture, we will definitely tell you about its eternal competitor, the British East India Company, and how it swallowed not only spices but entire peoples. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and share with friends to delve into the world of knowledge and mysteries together. See you next time.